Hello, 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 y'all. I am fortunate enough to be here today with Mr. Eduardo Braun. Eduardo, what are you doing here and who the heck are you?
Hello, Ryan. Thank you for inviting me. Well, if you want a short answer, I need a few days to, who am I? But let me start sharing a little bit of my story that gets into speaking and how I got into speaking. I'm an industrial engineer, then an MBA, and after working in strategy consulting, ended up as a partner in a leadership and management conferences organizer. In that role, I hired speakers. So I have like over 10 years of experience hiring speakers. That's one thing we'll dive into. The second is because we were an Argentine company and I had a better English than my partners, I started interviewing those great speakers, from the Francis Ford Coppola to Bill Clinton or Tony Blair and Jack Welch. So that gave me another insight into speaking. And finally, when we sold the company, I became a speaker myself. I wrote a book with my lessons learned, and I became a speaker myself. So all these perspectives add some information on the keys of speaking, of public speaking.
Awesome. Well, I think there's a lot that we can dive into there that I think will be particularly valuable for the ideal listener here. Which do you think you would want to start with? You're speaking, you're being the event organizer and picking the speakers, you're interviewing, your transition among the entire thing. Which part of your story do you think is most relevant to
I
start
think
with?
the most logical sequence is how I started by hiring speakers, how I wrote a book, and then how I became speaker. The business of management conferences, as it was in the early 2000s, was about bringing very famous people with big brand name. And we put together 1,000, 2,000 executives in a hotel hall or a bigger venue, and for 1 or 2 days in a row. And there are two things that are key. One is the relevance of the message, and the other is the emotions the speaker awakes while delivering the message. And people don't realize sometimes what's the difference. And it's interesting because in the event business, the emotions, how you motivate people, ends up being maybe more important than the content itself. I say the content is more in depth and better analyzed in a book this thick that's maybe out there for $20, and people pay $1,000 or $2,000 to be in the same room with a former president speaking for half an hour or 1 hour. But the relevance of what you have to say gives you also the relevance of how you awake emotions in other people, because sometimes just ordinary people, you won't pay to go there and hear to them. So understanding that in the speaking in business, you have to have something to say. And there I say, it has to be new or relevant, because sometimes new things are relatively irrelevant, and so people don't care about them. It has to be relevant, and relevant to whom? To your audience. So relevance, I think, is very important. And I would ask every one of your auditors, do you have something to say? Do you have something that is burning in your heart and you say, this could help people in certain ways? And it's in that way that you build your brand. I had some speakers that were relevant. For example, Garry Kasparov, former chess champion. We had him in many events talking about strategy and tactics. And one day he told me, I'd like to speak about innovation. And I said, that's great, but you don't have the credibility to speak about innovation. So you have to build your credibility to talk about the ideas that you have. That credibility will give you access to a TEDx or any other forum. If not, you don't have a chance. So that's for the first lessons as a speaker hire. Another one, but that's maybe for a second stage, is about the fees. You don't have to put yourself fees that keep you out of the market. I always say it's better to have a relatively low fee and do 30, 40 events per year, and then slowly increase the fees that starts with a very high fee and get out of the market in that way.
Awesome. I have one question that I think would be particularly relevant to those listening here, which is, you mentioned the credibility, that first step of credibility and establishing that credibility. Is that what you particularly used to land those big name guests that you mentioned? Because, that level of speaker is not gonna, I may understand it totally incorrectly, but there has to be, they have to see something to determine your event is even worth their time, or your podcast, or whatever the guest is making the decision to join you and spend their time speaking to you on. How did you kind of go about landing those guests?
They are professional speakers, so it's about the fees that you pay for them. And we had the #1 events in the world, so we did have our own credibility as event organizers, but that's professional speaking, and so there are fees involved.
So it just came down to the money paid. That makes a lot of sense. You could pay someone enough, they'll choose to fly. You hosted the events in Argentina, was that right? Or did you host them in the US?
New York, Italy, Germany, Spain, Mexico, Brazil, all over the world.
Very cool. And how many guests did you have at those events? Because I remember you mentioned you wrote a book about that, but how many guests and, I guess, interactions did you have to have before you felt you had that credibility to write a book on that experience?
Okay. First, if we're talking about in one single year, we would have over 60 events.
Wow.
Some events were 100 people, 2 days with Jack Welch, very intimate, and others were 4,000 or 5,000 people events. In terms of speakers, in one single year, we could have 200 of those speakers, or 200 contracts. Sometimes some of those speakers were in multiple events. So if you take 10 years, I really had zillions of interactions on stage, backstage, at their homes, in private planes. So I got to know them pretty well. But it was interesting, and that goes into the next part of the story. When we sold the company, I said I had so many things to share. And many of our events were on leadership, were on marketing, were on sales, were many different topics on management. But many of these topics, like marketing or strategy, are technical. And so most of the stuff is in the book, but in the strategy book or the marketing book. But when you talk about leadership, it's about the interaction with people. So the first-hand interaction with these guys gave me an insight that was a little bit beyond what they had said in their own book. So that's why I chose leadership to. And when I went over the hundreds of speakers I've had worked with and asked the question, what's their leadership style? What's the key on their leadership attitudes? I found that the common thread was people. They were people first leaders. And that's the name of the book, People First Leadership. That's published in Latin America in Spanish, in the US and Europe in English, and in China last year was published in China.
That's awesome. How's your Mandarin? You speak Mandarin as well?
No, not at all. But using the Google Translator, I had a chance to check the cover of the book if it had everything I wanted there to be.
There you go. And this is, I think, a question that I'm curious about, but I also know a lot of listeners here are curious about. What did your decision-making process look like as an event organizer when selecting speakers to come speak at your event and negotiating fees? What certain things did you look at to find that speaker and determine if you even wanted to consider their offer in the first place?
First, and this is how we curated the events generally had between 5 and 8 or 10 speakers, was the topics. So the most relevant topics in an event today, it would be artificial intelligence, it would be the metaverse. So depending on the profile of the event, if it was a World Business Forum or the World Leadership Forum or the World Marketing Forum, the topics we covered, the actual subjects. Then it was the quality of the speakers, their brand name, their recognition. And finally, in some of the cases, we had people that were not well known, but that I had identified by traveling around the world, hearing to many speakers, because that's what I did. You search for talent, and I heard many speakers. Some speakers were not known, but once you heard their presentation, you said, wow, that's a very interesting message. So I got a mixture of high quality names, very highly recognized, and people that were not, with a very high quality of delivery.
And at the time when you were organizing these events, were you speaking as well? You personally, or was that after?
No, I wasn't. But I was interviewing, and interviewing gave me insights on what the audience wants, because I had to learn, like you're doing now, to put myself in the shoes of the audience and say, I have this expert, Jack Welch or Bill Clinton. What would these guys like to know about my guest? And that exercise was also very interesting and very helpful to know who next to hire in my next event. So interviewing and moderating events was interesting in that sense to me too.
So how many years has it been now that you've kind of seen the speaking industry evolve? Like when you first got involved, it was what year? And obviously now it's 2024.
25 years ago.
Okay. So 1999, more or less?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. How, from the patterns you've kind of identified over these past 25 years, you've probably gotten very good at identifying certain patterns based on trends, based on things that are happening in this industry. And if you've gotten good at identifying those trends, you've probably gotten pretty good at seeing where they're going and kind of predicting these trends. Where do you see these patterns in speaking on a more macro level going in the next 5-10 years?
I don't know. I don't know. But let me give you some things I do know that have changed in the last 20 years.
Please.
20 years ago, the product life cycle of a speaker was the lifetime. By product life cycle, I mean, that marketing tool that says when you launch the product, how long it stays and then it declines.
Yeah.
Well, the Philip Kotlers, the Peter Druckers, the Michael Porters had a brand that stayed for life. 15 years ago, we had some speakers like Martha Rogers that came well known for a given subject, marketing one-to-one, Don Peppers and Martha Rogers, and that lasted for 5 years. Today, the product life cycle, I would say, is too short or non-existent, in the sense that it's very hard for a speaker to build a brand name that goes beyond one single spot, one single message. You do have, obviously, some. Another change was that the industry, the businesses, followed what these great gurus, the Druckers, the Porters, and the Kotlers, indicated them to do. They were really people that looked into the future, the gurus.
Right.
Today, academia is trying to understand why Google, Facebook, and Microsoft are successful. Academia is running behind. And the real leaders are people that generally don't speak. Steve Jobs spoke very little. Then you have, I don't know, Mark Zuckerberg or others. They don't speak generally. And so that's another trend. Are you going to share your own story or someone else's story? If you share your own story, that's definitely more valuable, but you need to have one.
That's interesting. For that person that they have their own story, but you're mentioning there's a shorter life cycle these days. Let's say the life cycle of their story proves relevant for 5 years. How do you suggest they go interviewing other people to learn things kind of like you did and stay relevant?
I don't know. we are in a changing world, and I do believe. Let me share another example.
Please.
A lot of the gurus are university professors. They do research and they write books based on their research. I am part of the 10% like them that are more journalist type, that look for other people's insights and try to put them together in a new way. Malcolm Gladwell has done that for many years. So one way to stay relevant is to try and make sense of the new data that is coming up in your own field. What is going on? What's happening? And there, some discipline is very important. Tal Ben-Shahar, a Harvard professor on the happiness course, told me, I sit down every day at a given time to write. And sometimes I write a sentence, sometimes I write 10 pages. But that discipline of sitting down and writing implies reading, implies reflecting on the readings. I think it's part of a very good discipline to stay relevant for the next 4 or 5 years.
And of these people that you've talked to and been able to have these conversations with, what would you say is the one main lesson, if that's even possible, that you got from all these people that sticks with you personally the most, that every day it might cross your mind and you might be reminded of that one lesson? Is there one of those?
Can't find one. In terms of leadership, the one lesson is focus on people. People are most important. But in terms of speaking, have something to say. But I wouldn't recognize any one particular of these gurus saying that to me.
And for the person out there that, they're kind of into speaking and they're building their business out, they're speaking and they're realizing something that they're saying is really hitting with their audience, so much so that they're considering starting their own events. What advice do you have for that person? That's kind of where you were, however long after you started into that entire world.
First, when I started on the event business, there was no internet or practically no internet. So that was a different world. I say today that I would only recommend to start an event if you truly, deeply believe in the purpose of that event. You don't start an event because you say, oh, the shipping industry needs an event. Yeah, maybe it does, but I would leave that to the ship lovers. So start an event only if you really deeply love what you do and what you want to accomplish, because it's very difficult to be successful, I think. And generally today, the event business is part of a bigger business. Many companies use the event business as a way of marketing. So they don't charge, they absorb their costs with their own, with other businesses. So it's tough. And it's, for me, I found it very difficult to have something relevant and new to say frequently. I always say that it took me 25 years to write the book, 20 to have something to say, and 5 to put it black on white. So it's tough to have things interesting and relevant to say very often.
Hmm. Do you, I know one of the things that I personally find super relevant that keeps me coming back to events these days, and I'm curious if you saw this with your event attendees, is the network, the awesome connections you can build with really cool people that are interested in that same thing and are willing to pay to learn about that thing. Do you notice that's something of value to the events that you were
Yes,
holding?
yes, I agree. I say if you want to start an event today, I would start by building a community rather than an event. So in that
Interesting.
sense, because that community would have a common purpose. I remember I was part of the Clinton Global Initiative for 5 years, and everyone felt part of the same purpose, the same community.
Right.
So I think that's great. Another interesting example that I just remembered was Stephen Covey. Stephen Covey wrote a book, The 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, and then turned that book into a $300 million business per year, because it gave training, agendas, and many other businesses around that same concept. But you have to have a very, very, very powerful concept to do that. It's also interesting to think in a talk, in a keynote speech, in a TEDx, really the purpose or the most desirable outcome is to have people feel something for what you're saying and say, wow,
Right.
this is interesting, this is great, but it's just the first move in an aha moment. What if we put the necessary steps to take that into action? Because a lot of the people that say aha after a TEDx never changed their behaviors. And it's all about changing life and behaviors, your own, your teams, your colleagues.
Yeah. I know I heard a business leader that I follow and listen to quite a bit, Alex Ramosi. He said one thing. He said, if you change none of your behaviors after investing money in an event, you're wasting all of your money because you're not getting any change. You're not getting the change you're paying for. It sounds like that's kind of what you're saying. Is that right?
Yeah. And let me add another interesting thing that I learned in the last 20 years in the event business.
Please.
While I was at the World Business Forum, we put, as I said, marketing content, strategy content, leadership content. But in the last few years, I sort of learned that they are of a different nature. You can learn strategy by just reading and hearing and thinking because it's basically a conceptual knowledge.
Right.
But you can't learn empathy by just reading books or watching videos. You need to practice, you need to change. And leadership is about human behavior. So there are certain things that are not technical, but rather what I call life skills or soft skills. And those need training, need a very different approach if you want to adopt them. And I would say that in the business world, 20 or 30 years ago, the only relevant knowledge was technical, engineering, marketing, finance. If you were a jerk, excuse my French, or didn't have communication skills or didn't have team spirit, it wasn't that important. Today, it's essential. And we can get into why that changed. And basically is because the rate of change has accelerated in such a way that you need to adapt permanently and redefine the technical variables. And to do that, you need conversational skills. And that's the agile methodologies. You need permanently to listen, to doubt, curiosity, empathy, a lot of skills that are not taught in the basic technical schools.
One question that I'm asking a lot of the guests I'm having here that is seeming to be very normal for the guests is, for a lot of speakers, there's a point in your career where you decide to write a book for whatever motivation that is. Maybe that's a higher speaking fee. Maybe that's you want to put something on pen and paper that lasts forever because you want to leave your legacy. Maybe that's whatever it is. How did you go from that transition of interviewing people and learning from them to deciding finally, hey, you know what? I'm learning so much. I'm going to write a book.
Yeah. Well, I would say there were two basic motivations. One is that when we sold the company, my experience was in hiring global speakers. How many companies do you know that have a job search of people with experience of hiring global speakers? None. So I had to reinvent myself to really find new jobs. I went into being a board member and other things, back to consulting. But I thought, and the second reason was that I thought I had a very interesting experience, and a friend said, you should write a book. And I said, I agree. And it's also interesting that I thought the book as chapters by speaker, my interviews with Clinton, my interviews with Jack Welch. But then I saw that there were common threads across the speakers. And that's finally the structure I found for the book, more about the roles of a leader with examples from across the board. Another interesting, I think, we're touching very different aspects of the content of a keynote, whether it's technical or soft skill, whether it's something you go into people's head or into people's minds and hearts. Another thing that I always told speakers in my job as hirer of speakers was try to think what's interesting and relevant to the audience, not to you. Because sometimes speakers get into the nitty-gritty of a research they're doing that's irrelevant for the people. So focusing on what's relevant for the audience and how can they take that into their lives, I think that's a good recommendation on speakers' content.
People first. Sounds familiar with your book on, right? Yeah. And for these, as the internet kind of developed, where did you find these speakers? Because I know a lot of speakers I talk to, maybe they're working with bureaus or they're on directories, or as someone finding these speakers, where did you go to find them? And then did it get to a point where it was just warm inbound and you had these speakers coming to you wanting to speak for you?
Yes, all of the above. We had speaker bureaus that recommended speakers. I traveled to different events to watch for new speakers. And so it was all of the above. I would say that when I wrote the book and I transitioned into a speaker myself, I went into many speaker bureaus because I had worked with them and they all added my bio to their roster, but that's not enough to get events. You need, in my view, at least one event with them so that they see you in action, because they can only sell the event. They can only sell you if they saw you, if they really worked with you before.
Good to know. And then for the speakers out there that are deciding to either go to speakers bureaus or market their territory somehow with social media or give a TED talk or write a book to kind of get that first, like you were saying at the beginning of this convo, their first credibility key that can mark their territory, kind of put the flag on the sand. What do you recommend or see these days that works best for speakers to put that first stamp of credibility to then be recognized as a speaker and book more gigs?
Well, generally that comes from your own experience as an entrepreneur, as a successful manager of a turnaround, and you have a story to tell, from research. And that's why it's very tough, because you're competing with thousands and thousands of other people that are doing the same things.
And how do you recommend speakers differentiate themselves to event organizers today?
Well, first, let me go a step backwards. There are two different type of events. One is industry events, or events where you say there are people from many, many companies. There, I think there are also marketing events. So I would prioritize those events with a lower fee because you reach to many more people. And then there are the in companies. The in companies is one single company. There you need to really have a revenue, because that's ultimately the source where you add value and you take value there. When you go to speaker bureaus, you need short video clips you need a 1 minute or 1 minute and a half video clip of you as a speaker that gives idea of the power that you can have in your voice, the stage, how you move on stage. If you have experience, because you have clips from very different events and big events, that gets communicated in 90 seconds. And then more professional speaker bureaus or even event organizers want to look for 20 minutes of your speech. If you really have a storytelling, that's something we didn't touch on, but how you design your speech, it's also very relevant.
And you've seen these patterns in the past. When did you notice podcasting become more of a decentralized, democratized type thing where anybody, if they were courageous enough, which is not that hard to start a podcast, hardest jump to go over is up here, right? When did you notice that kind of becoming a thing?
Well, first, it started with YouTube. There's a famous author that we had in one of our events 15 years ago that wrote a book that's called The Long Tail. And The Long Tail talks about those many speakers that have very small audience, or those books that have a small sales. In terms of podcasts, I would say the pandemic made it more, I think, exponential. But it's also tough to have a business model on podcast. And I would ask you, what's your experience there? It can serve you as a way of getting a message through, but you need to make your living in a different way, or you have to have a couple of million subscribers.
Yeah, I think it depends on the person's motivation for building the podcast. Like for me in this case, it's being able to connect with people like you and other guests that have awesome information that I learn a ton from. I'm taking notes over here, right? And I know if I'm taking notes on it, the information is valuable enough that the listeners will find it valuable as well. And if they find value in it, maybe they'll follow for more and learn more, and then who knows what will come from that in the future. When we first go for it.
But then it's a part-time job, because you do it to get to know interesting people, but you make a living elsewhere.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, this is the podcast I'm doing is not monetized. Do it totally for free. I enjoy it myself. It's kind of a hobby, but I also get to meet really cool people and learn awesome stuff that I think you don't learn this stuff in university or high school or any kind of education. And I think that's the coolest part. It's kind of like what you said, is all these people have all of this awesome information in their heads. It's just there's not a bridge to bring it from them to everybody who needs to find it valuable. And I love this platform being that bridge. It's pretty cool. One thing that you mentioned earlier, I want to touch on, because it's kind of it's a dream of a lot of people, myself as well, is that point of traveling the world and speaking at different events. One speaker I spoke to, he said he loved it at the beginning, but he said, like everything, it got to a point where he didn't want to get on another plane and travel to another place, give another gig. He just got so bored of it. For you, when did that happen, where you kind of got the fatigue of, I love this at one point, but it's just not doing it for me anymore? When did that happen for you, or has it not yet?
No, not yet. Not yet. I travel, but I have 6 kids, but they're old already. So, so maybe I travel 10 times or 12 times per year for gigs, and then I do locally. So I started doing a lot digitally. I also thought when I did travel, connecting with certain associations is a good source of multiplying your gigs. I remember at some point PMI, the Project Management Institute. I did one, they loved it, and they hired me in different locations. I went from Singapore to Gdansk in Poland, or Arizona in the US, or Rio de Janeiro. And so, as a marketing tool for speakers, if you really engage with those peer-to-peer networks, YPO, Renaissance Executive Forum, Entrepreneurs Organization, you can hit a one gig and then 10 after with the same association.
It's awesome. I know when you mentioned associations, the first ones that came to my mind were NSA and Rotary, because I know those two are really common for speakers to use to kind of get started. How did you make that jump from the freebie organizations like NSA and Rotary to the paid organization gigs?
Well, again, maybe I had a speaker bureau called HiQ Speakers that I had worked with as a director of the World Business Forum, that had engaged, that believed in me and said, I love your story. And he directly engaged me for speaking engagement, paid speaking engagements. So I really went directly to paid speaking engagements. I had a very different story in that sense. There are not many people out there that have interviewed, the 50 most admired leaders of the 20th century.
Right. And I know we're coming close on time here. So I want to ask you, I got two more questions for you. First one is, I've found you so valuable. If I'm listening here right now and I think, where can I find Eduardo? I want to follow him. I want to keep him in my life somehow. Where can people find you on the internet?
This week, I'm publishing my new website. I have it, but LinkedIn would be the best place, because I believe in dialogue, and I believe that even the book is work in progress, because I love receiving feedback from the book. But if not, my website is Eduardo P. Braun, and there you can see more about me. But the best way to connect with me is through LinkedIn. I don't know if we have here in the chat. Let me share with you the Eduardo P. Braun, altogether.com, altogether in one word. Like it appears down here, my name.
Yep, that's the site I was checking out for. Yeah, it's a good quality site. And then the very last question is, what last piece of advice do you have from your 25 years of experience as a speaker, author, event organizer, the whole nine, for the aspiring speaker, the professional speaker, or the business owner who speaks as a function of their business?
The aspiring speaker, professional speaker, or the business owner that would like to become a speaker.
That does speak for their business, yeah. And it's kind of debating, does this make sense for me? Do I get an ROI on doing this? I'm not sure. Is my money and time better spent doing something else for my business? The person that's debating those questions.
Well, to the aspiring speaker, the first question I would invite them to ask themselves is, do I really believe I have something unique and relevant to share? Or is it my own ego that's in there because I'd like to be on a stage? First thing. To a professional speaker, which implies that the audience has validated that you have something interesting to say, I would invite to upgrade the message. I found that the business world is changing so much that on whatever topic you speak about, you need to update it and put that content in relevance with the audience and the audience emotions. If you need to wake up people's hearts and talk to the heart. And there are two good ways to get into people's heart? One is to talk from your own experience and your own heart in first. And second, to study a structure of storytelling that I won't get into, but storytelling has a given structure that immediately creates empathy with the storyteller. And to the business owner, I would ask, like in the first candidate, why do you really want to be a speaker? Why? There's so many content out there. Why do you want to be a speaker?
Boom. Love it. Well, Eduardo, we will wrap it up here. And if you have found this valuable, you guys know where you can find him on LinkedIn or his website, Eduardo P. Braun. That is Braun, not Broun. Porque Eduardo, tú eres argentino, and así se escribe en español. So cool. We'll wrap it up here, and I hope you guys found that valuable. Cheers, y'all. Thanks for listening.